Thank you so much, Jim. I want to thank Mary Beth and Aaron and Jim for this lovely invitation, and all of you for being here. And I promise you I will fangirl right back. My current professional title is Director and Librarian at a rare books library that's on the campus at Brown. But I am not, and nor would I pretend to be, a trained librarian. That's where my fangirling comes in. It's a tough time to be anybody in the knowledge industries right now. I know I don't need to say that to you all. But it's also true that as I walked around this conference, the energy and the vibe was so good. I don't know if that's just in the elevators in the hallways or around the coffee stations or maybe at the bar. But it seems like that sense of commitment and kind of purposeful work is really here. I hope that's true. I was raised absolutely as a library kid, and I want to say a few words about my kind of journey to librarianship of a kind. That is, being director of a rare books library is not being a librarian in many of the ways that you all practice. But I was, the Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh was my childhood library. I still feel misty-eyed about it. I was back in Pittsburgh about 8 years ago for a conference that we were hosting, that the Omohundro Institute was hosting at Pitt. And my parents had just been moving and found a copy of a Mary Poppins book that I had checked out and not returned, checked it out in 1972. So I thought, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to the library, and it's going to be amazing, and I'm going to return the book. And bless the librarian who was at the circulation desk, who was like, oh, okay. We wrote it off a long time ago. And I was like, yeah, but it was like 5 cents a day, and I'm here with this check for like, I don't know what it was, like $387 or something. And they're like, well, the price of the late fees has increased too. And I was like, so it was a moment for me, but I think the point was that it was just kind of all in a day's work. When you're at a library, people come in and they have ideas and they have enthusiasms and they have energy for things that may not be, kind of on your priority list for the day, but the things you kind of roll with to give them a sense of library joy and of what it's like to learn constantly, to be enthused about what we're learning from fiction, from nonfiction, from multiple formats, from all the different ways that libraries are serving communities of all kinds. So my library fandom knows no bounds. Now, it's not enough to be a library fan to be a library director. I can tell you that. In fact, it can kind of work against you because, I'm a historian. I'm a kind of standard issue academic historian. A lot of people are pretty enthusiastic about history too. And there's a difference between being enthusiastic about something and being a professional and having kind of deep expertise honed over a long career. And you want to really always navigate the relationship between that enthusiasm and also professional expertise. So I came to my job from running a research institute at William & Mary, which mostly focuses on publication, publishes a fantastic book series, publishes the leading journal in early American history, the William & Mary Quarterly. And I was really deeply into learning about how and thinking about how this kind of, from one perspective, could be seen as niche publication in one kind of small field, fitted into the large world of scholarly publishing, an enormous global industry which is, in dollar terms, larger than the musical industry, and which is largely driven by the kinds of work that I do not do. STEM publication, primarily biomedical. Those of you in academic libraries know how your budgets are driven by biomedical and not by history and not by little journals like the ones that we published. So we, that journal, although we published the book series with the great University of North Carolina Press, we self-published the William & Mary Quarterly, and that felt like an important thing to do because it helped us understand the true, real costs of publication. And it helped us understand, literally down to the price of the soy ink and changing from polybags to paper for mailing, what was really inherent. And of course, the real cost of publication was in the expert staff, editors, developmental editing, copy editing, and then of course production and design and so on. And I loved learning about that business and thinking about how my small part of the world, which of course I think is the most important part of the world, because if everybody knew more early American history, the world might be a little different. I am persuaded of that. But how our small dollar-wise part of the world related to this giant industry. And it informed how I thought about why I wanted to move into thinking through library collections. We entered into some projects, some digital projects. Probably the most prominent one was the Georgian Papers program, which was a collaborative project with the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, where we were digitizing what I think of as the last great privately held collection related to the American Revolution, which is the papers and materials of George III and his court. And that project was terrific and also really educated me in profound ways about what I thought I already knew, which was the power and structure of information, which is basically metadata. And as I got more enthused about and serious about how librarianship and collections work and its relationship to the scholarly enterprise was as deeply important as publishing and as complex, and of course as reliant on expert labor and expert professionals, I began thinking more about a next step for myself in learning through this world of knowledge production. I thought about going to library school. I was dissuaded. Anyway, and this opportunity came up to go to the John Carter Brown Library, which is a specialty library. It's relatively small. It's entirely rare materials, non-circulating. But I'll say one more thing about having been at the JCB and how important thinking about librarianship as a library director, but also librarianship and the expertise of the folks in our staff is, which is, I was telling friends, Redex friends at dinner last night that I'm probably proudest of the fact that over the last 3 years since I got to the JCB, we went from having a single cataloger to having a full 4-person cataloging team. And we now have the largest dedicated reading room staff at the library that we've ever had of entirely professional librarians. That means committing ourselves to core library work. We also do other things. We serve scholars who are coming into our library. We expanded fellowships, and we did a lot of things. But the point is that if you don't do the core library work, you can't do anything else. And that has been a real joy, and it has been you'll see a theme here is I just love to learn through the work, but for me that has been just a real key learning experience working with my colleagues who are such experts. So, okay, so enough about library fan stuff. I think we're there. Okay. I'm going to talk today about using this book that I've just finished. I'm going to use it as an opportunity to talk about different levels of research and different kinds of research, because I've done this work over decades, which means that some of the first work I did was downloading an incredible amount of stuff from early American imprints, printing it out, tabbing it and tagging it with a highlighter and Post-it notes, moving to the age of exceptional, like local level digitization projects where I could work backwards from materials that I'd already been in to get a more comprehensive look and understanding of those materials. So I'm going to just talk quickly about what this book says about genealogy and how it's practiced everywhere in early America and why I think that matters. What's particular to British America, who in early British America was practicing genealogy, and the answer to that is kind of everyone. How it's kind of local and why it's a real kind of gateway to thinking about history, which many of you who work in public libraries or academic libraries will know. Genealogy is a real source of enthusiasm and interest for our readers. So the first thing to say is that genealogy was everywhere in early America. When I first started working on this project, I went to one of the principal genealogical libraries in the country and said, look, I just started getting interested in this project because some of the 18th century folks that I'm interested in, I keep seeing them ask questions about when cousin so-and-so was married and what were the birth dates of their grandparents. And I thought, don't these people know they're living in the 18th century, the age of individualism, it's the American Revolution, like, you know, this kind of large lineage kinship thing doesn't matter anymore. What are these people doing there? It's like the genealogists who are right around me. I don't understand it. I want to pursue this topic. So I'm looking at genealogy in the 18th century, and no kidding, the person just looked right at me and said, genealogy did not exist in America before the 19th century. And I think what they meant, and probably if they could reel that comment back now some years later, I think what they meant was in the 19th century, we get genealogical societies established and historical societies established. Like, we all know that the histories of our institutions matter a lot. Like, when was your institution founded? Why was it founded? By whom was it founded? You know, I think about Brown University. It's founded in the 18th century. It's founded by the Brown family, merchant family, who have deep connections to transatlantic slavery. And they're interested in mostly educating guys like the sons of the Brown family. My library was founded as a private library, a gentleman's library. It was interested in X, Y. We all know institutional histories matter. So these genealogical societies that were founded in the 19th century and historical societies in the 19th century had particular interests. Most of them local, however they defined their local, or sometimes that was regional, but also really focused often on elite families or founder families, always focused on settler families, occasionally with an interest in what they exoticized as indigenous family connections, and that those places published a lot in the 19th century, local histories. Like if you look at the groaning library shelves of local histories produced where I live in New England now, they're intense, or the kind of genealogies that were published at the same time. So I'm pretty sure that what that person meant was capital G genealogy as a formalized practice begins in the 19th century and you can't have it earlier. Sorry, that's not a project. But it turns out that's not so. Vernacular genealogy is one of my Instagram accounts where I actually put stuff that I just run into in libraries because I can't resist them, and that is really subsequent to when I finished the research for this book. Because the thing is, this stuff is everywhere. Once you start to look, you cannot unsee it. An interest in genealogy, and by genealogy I use vernacular genealogy to mean the kind of everyday ambient information that people were collecting and were interested in about their family connections in the 18th century. It's everywhere. It's in court records. You cannot open any 18th century court records and not see a density of family relationships being articulated. Maybe it's an inheritance suit, maybe it's a property case, maybe somebody is arguing, we need a road here. No kidding, we need a road here. My cousin has this land and the so-and-so has that land. Or there are cases like the ones I'm currently obsessed with in one of my next projects, which is about kids born to unmarried moms who are in court in late 18th century Massachusetts arguing for support from the dads, where they lay out a whole family history of both partners. So those kids, actually there is a whole family history laid out there in these petitions. So you can't go to court records without seeing genealogy. And of course, the most consequential genealogies of all, those connected to slavery and freedom. In Virginia, where I'm from, the court records, those that survived the burning of Richmond during the Civil War, the court records are full of manumission records in the late 18th century where people are articulating their family relationships, their deep family relationships, to argue why they should be free. Or there are cases where there is an inheritance of an enslaver to their enslaved descendant, and they are articulating the relationships of the enslaved people that they are treating as inherited property. So court records are just lousy with genealogical relationship all the time. And also, people are constantly articulating their family relationships, and I'm going to give you a bunch of examples of these as we go through. But there's so much of it that it's just kind of, you can't unsee it, and it's just all over the place. It was important to me in this book, you can tell from my comments about historicizing institutions, to historicize the phenomenon of genealogy. I think genealogy is one of those topics that we think is sort of like ahistorical. It sort of floats out there in the universe as something that like either people have always been interested in and are always doing, or that if you do it, it's kind of undifferentiated. We just imagine that genealogy is just this unitary thing. But like anything, genealogy has a history, and it's practiced differently in different places and at different times. So it doesn't always look the same. Scholars have just begun, really in the last decade or so, thinking about genealogy and its history and how it looks different at different places and times. So, for example, a wonderful scholar out at Stanford about 12 years ago, 15 years ago now, published a fantastic book, and there's been subsequent work on what genealogy looks like in 18th century China. Turns out it's a lot about tax practices and the tax law. We could talk about that at the Q&A. But there are different ways in which, even in early America, genealogy looks different because the law is different. So in French colonies or in the Spanish colonial context, genealogy looks different. People are collecting different kind of information. My book is about British America, and I'm interested in what's specific to 18th century British America. It's always a little tricky to explain to people that I want to talk about genealogy writ large, that I want people to walk away from this book thinking differently about something they think they know, genealogy, and something that often gets kind of derided or marginalized in all kinds of ways. There's still ways in which people talk about how genealogy is sort of looked down on by scholars. I'm not sure that's entirely true anymore, but certainly there was a sense of this kind of hierarchy of knowledge seeking. But, you know, also I think historicizing genealogy helps us to think harder about what is the current context for genealogy, which is a deeply meaningful practice. It always has been deeply meaningful. It can create connections among people. It can be restorative or even reparative work. And we've seen how that works. But it can also be coercive, and it can also be extractive. So I wanted people to walk away from this book thinking differently about something they thought they knew. And that, I understand, kind of pulls against also my insistence on focusing on 18th century British America. Because it's like, well, if you want to talk about genealogy, actually I'm writing a very short introduction book for Oxford too that will talk about all of this. But if you want to talk about genealogy writ large, why are you going to focus so closely on British America? And partly it's to make this argument that genealogy is not just a universal, undifferentiated practice or idea or feeling or meaning or implication, but that it has very specific contexts. Some of those are deeply local, and some of them are broader. So here, because I'm in Philadelphia, and because Philadelphia is a place that I've done a lot of work and was a place that I did some of my earlier book work, I've just pulled an example here from the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, just a little bit up the road here, from the Lloyd Norris family, a really powerful political merchant family, Quaker family in 18th century Philadelphia, who were really deeply invested in their genealogy. I've written a whole chapter in the book about their transatlantic genealogical work and how it facilitated their thinking about the economy, about politics, and about their own implication in slavery also, like doing genealogical work to think about how they were complicit there. It's really, really interesting kind of family. But here I just wanted to show you yet another example of how, you know, every time you turn around, they're doing this stuff. This is from a late 18th century example from Joseph Parker Norris. He's a late 18th, early 19th century member of this family. And he created these scrapbooks, probably with the help of his mother. But what he did was he had earlier 18th century materials that he cut out and pasted into these scrapbooks. And they're all kinds of stuff. It's stuff about marriage records, birth records, in particular his great-grandparents who were very powerful, and there's a lot of woo around being descended from these particular people, Thomas and Mary Lloyd. But also all kinds of crazy things. Like there's a piece in that scrapbook that is like clearly a bunch of cousins got together in the 1760s and they made a list of how much each person weighed. I'm not kidding. And then what the total was. And I'm like, what? I don't know what you, like, what is that? I mean, anyway, so like fascinating stuff, family memory, family history. It's kind of all over the place. And some of this is super particular to British American context. In British America, unlike, for example, in French colonies or in the Spanish colonies, Protestantism is a key feature of genealogical thinking, and the way that, and there's a whole lot to say about this, I'm being really general here, but there's a whole lot to say about how and why Protestantism drives genealogical thinking and production in British America. A second is simply the monarchy, the fact that they live in and with and under a government that is predicated on succession. The ideal succession of father to son, which never goes that way. Anybody who knows their 17th and 18th century history knows that it's a total mess, from the Stuarts to Cromwellian Puritan regime, back to the Stuarts, and then to the Hanovers. It's wreckage. There's never, father to son never works, I think is the point here. But nonetheless, that emphasis on succession, the fact that the monarchs always emphasize that that succession is divinely authorized. That again goes back to Protestantism and the particular way they attach their authority to Protestantism. And then the law. British law is very particularly, preferentially patriarchal. That is that women can inherit, but it always prefers father to son inheritance, and it always prefers lineal inheritance to lateral inheritance. And the law, if you just think about it, like when I was first doing a project, a related project on the law last summer, I looked up what the intestate law is in Rhode Island where I live to see, okay, so I die without a will, so what happens? And what happens is that Rhode Island is extremely invested, as every place is, in finding out who I'm related to. They want to know about my spouse, they want to know about my kids, they want to know about my darling sister and my baby nephews, and they want to know about the whole panoply there, because it turns out they've got to figure out how to distribute my stuff according to my family relationships. And that is absolutely grounded in this British American ideal of having all of your property sorted out among first the family of marriage and children, and then to collateral kin. And if you look, for example, at William Blackstone, who is the most important legal thinker and writer in the 18th century British American and British Atlantic world, and is still cited by the Supreme Court today, a huge chunk of Blackstone is about genealogy. Huge, incredible family charts and lots of conversation about how a lawyer in the 18th century can figure out who's related to whom. So Protestantism, monarchy, law, all of these things make this culture very, very genealogical. And then there are some particularities to it. Okay, so let's talk about an important example here, George Washington. I don't like to pick on other scholars. It's not nice, but I'm going to. I think he can take it. So Ron Chernow, super famous because he wrote the Hamilton biography that Lin-Manuel Miranda adapted for the fantastic Broadway play. He also won a Pulitzer Prize for his biography of George Washington. This is literally chapter 1. This is how Chernow opens this biography of George Washington. The crowded career of George Washington afforded him little leisure to indulge his vanity or gratify his curiosity by conducting genealogical research into his family. There's a reason why he starts that way, but let me just say that what he's saying is George Washington is too busy for this thing that is just about vanity or just about curiosity. In other words, genealogy is over there on the distaff side, like not important, and George Washington definitely too fancy and important and busy to care about it. Au contraire, definitely 100% wrong. George Washington cared a lot about genealogy, as did every person of significant property. I would argue just about every person in British America for different reasons, but every person of significant property cared a lot. So another thing to know about George Washington is that very little of his early material survives. He was a guy who cared a lot about his papers. Like, he designed the trunks that would carry his papers during the Revolutionary War. He was really, really into making sure that his papers were kept carefully. And yet, very little from his early life. I think he curated, I think he self-curated, but so little survives. So what does survive is very telling, I think, including his surveyor notebooks. He was a surveyor, he's self-taught. He goes out and surveys land so that he can buy some, and some of his friends can buy some, actually. But anyway, when you go to the Library of Congress, the fabulous Library of Congress, and you encounter one of the 300 red leather-bound elephant folio volumes that hold the Washington papers, it's an experience, and it's quite a thing to be able to get in there to do that. And I went to see this particular item that Chernow had overlooked. And that was clear, absolutely, Washington papers, I've had a whole long thing with them, absolutely, this is George Washington. This is a family tree that George Washington wrote when he was a teenager. He was 16 or 17 years old when he wrote this family tree. And it shows 5 generations of Washingtons, beginning with his great-grandparents, John and Anne, Pope Washington, down to George's little nieces, his half-brother, Lawrence's little girls. In fact, George Washington inherited Mount Vernon from those girls when they died. We don't often say that George Washington had Mount Vernon because he inherited it from his dead toddler nieces, but that is the case. So George Washington, like lots of people, was really interested in genealogy. But I think what's important here is that this item tells us so much about Washington and about the significance of genealogy. For one thing, it was miscatalogued at the library because, and I'll show you this in a minute, they never turned the page over and thought that the other side of the page was significant. Secondly, no version of the Washington papers, not the original Washington papers editions, nor the current fantastic, although they've inserted it now, Washington papers ever included this because it was seen as insignificant, not important enough to include. So let's turn that page over. On the other side of George Washington's family tree is a list of tithables. There are 2 things I want to point out here to you. One is that list of tithables, and the second is that label in script, the genealogy of the Washington family in Virginia. That list of tithables is a list of people that George Washington inherited from his father and from his brother Lawrence. And we know their names in part because of the exceptional work that Mount Vernon folks have done in elaborating the names and the family connections of people enslaved by the Washingtons at Mount Vernon and at other of their farms and plantations. So this list, we can find all these people, Akko and Moll and Frank and Ben and so on. We can find them on others of these lists, and we can date this list because of the timing of that inheritance. He probably wrote this in 1752 or 53 when his father had died and his brother was dying or had just died. And that label there, the genealogy of the Washington family in Virginia, 2 things to say about that. One, you can see the fold lines on the paper, and yes, I have neurotically made photocopies to scale of this item and then folded it, and then was very nicely, the curators at Mount Vernon let me go into Washington's study to confirm my suspicion that this was the precise size and fold for the cubbyhole in Washington's study. That label, Genealogy of the Washington Family in Virginia, Washington surely wrote in the 1780s or 1790s, and we know that because his handwriting changed over time. He got fancier with his handwriting and more self-conscious about it, and this is very much his later rounded, I'm a general and a president kind of handwriting. But this one piece, I think, on two sides, Washington's family tree and the list of tithables, shows really the potency of genealogy in early British America. It shows how the relationships among one group of people could implicate the freedom of another group of people and their descendants. So here I go back to my point that genealogy was meaningful, it was emotionally powerful. George Washington was really attached to his brother Lawrence in particular, very proud of his father, Augustine Washington. But it also shows you just how powerfully important genealogy was as a source of inherited wealth and status, and how it defined the line between freedom and slavery. And although I've talked about Washington here, you could go to to quote Lin-Manuel Miranda, every other founding father, every single one. Franklin, we think of it as the great autobiography, the great individualistic Benjamin Franklin, begins with a story of going to England and doing genealogical research. John and Abigail Adams. I mean, you just go on and on. It used to be a thing for me. I would be like, all right, Madison, let me see. Yep, sure. James Monroe. Yep, I can totally do it. At any one of them, you find it. And they're interested and invested in genealogy. But also ordinary people are as well. Someone asked me a great question when I was first working on the book. What about people who weren't that interested in genealogy? And, my answer there is, you may not be interested in genealogy, but genealogy is always interested in you. There was a lot of collection of data and a lot of extraction of family relationships, sometimes to serve things like slavery and sometimes for other purposes. This is an example of a very common little family history notebook that I found in research after I finished the book, but it's in my local Rhode Island Historical Society papers by a young woman named Hannah Waterman. In 1770, no, I guess I didn't go into the details there. Rats. Okay, I have another beautiful slide that shows when you open this little notebook, it's got family records of her grandparents' marriages and births, of her brothers who were in the merchant trade on ships, some of whom died at sea, of her parents, her siblings, her nieces and nephews, and so on. In other words, this is a little family record notebook, and that's a relatively common thing to find, although they didn't survive necessarily in the archives. And then, relatedly, when we say that governments are really interested in family relationships because governments have to do things like decide who inherits, but also they have to decide who belongs to the community. This is an example also from Rhode Island of a marriage certificate, which is important. There's a law in just about every colony that says you have to keep good records of births, marriages, and deaths. So the minister of the Congregational Church is sending this marriage certificate over, but more importantly, the clerk of the town on the back records where that information is going. This is #GovDocs. This is government information. This is the origins of the data state, if we want to get big about it. Okay, so there is so much to say about why genealogy matters in early America and how pervasive the practice was, but also what the implications might be for how we think about our own relationship to the deeply important connections of family memory, and family history. But the last thing I want to say is how many times, as you could have seen through those slides, I was encountering information in different kinds of libraries that the information was deeply local. That list of tithables, understanding that list of tithables was not obviously the work of me being at the Library of Congress looking at those big red volumes. That was going to the Library of Virginia and thinking about how many lists of tithables they've been able to locate for the 18th century. It's vanishingly few, under a dozen last time I looked, and why that might be, why those might be such scarce materials and rarely preserved items, or thinking about how much digital access to things like Hannah Waterman's notebook changed and improved my research, but also how much very, very local interests drive so many researchers. genealogists writ large. And I like to think that historians can do better by going smaller to understand the big stories, and often genealogists can do better by thinking broader about contexts in order to understand their local story. So thank you so much, and I would love to talk more.